Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Terry Martin with the Illinois Channel, and I'm joined once again with Jeff Berkowitz in Chicago. And Jeff, the Congress is now on vacation for Easter for the next 2 weeks coming in the end of April. But I want this week we're going to be taking a look at some of the changes that can be coming up in the near future. And that's the nature of politics, ladies and gentlemen, that once you get rid of one election after talking about all the candidates as we did in the presidential race, we're soon going to be focusing our attention on what's coming up. And Jeff and I are going to be spending some of our show this week talking about who might be running for the U.S. Senate and for the governor. And Jeff, so far, I think it looks like we're all waiting, those of us who are potential candidates in Illinois, as well as we in the media, trying to decide whether Governor Pritzker is going to tell us he's running for another term and whether Senator Durbin will be running. Give me your thoughts on where we stand at this time, and we'll get into some of the other potential candidates.
Well, both Senator Durbin was expected to announce much earlier. I would think people started thinking he would announce soon after President Trump was inaugurated, like in January 20 or so, because, well, for various reasons, they expected that. I think people were pretty clear he wouldn't be running. I think he'd be 82, I believe. He's 80 now, I think. So come the time of the election, he'd be nearabouts 82, 80. He's getting to be somewhat older. So people were pretty sure he would not run for reelection. But lately, in the last weekend, he said one, he'll be announcing in the next few weeks. And two, he said just a few days ago, he said to the media, gee, I really love this job. Did I tell you how much I love this job? So, sort of a buzz. Maybe he's having second thoughts. He had some corrective surgery in the last few months, feeling a little better on that physically. The short, I think people would say he probably won't run, but it's up in the air, and it's likely he will tell us by the end of April. That's the short of it. And and at the same time, people were expecting Pritzker to announce, and he's put that off for a while. But he said recently he'll
Maybe
essentially
they're just
announce by the end
deciding
of
they'll
April.
come back after April. Maybe they thought, since everything is going to come to a grinding halt for a couple of weeks here, the
Right.
Congress is out, the legislature is taking their break, that they just thought, look,
It's
I'll kind of sit on the decision and go forward. And then we'll maybe be hearing
it's
then basically in May, because it takes so much money when you're talking about running for the U.S. Senate, and so much money. I mean, these Senate races now go up to like $100 million in some cases. The recent run in South Carolina hit $100 million. It
well, we wouldn't expect the general election
well, and in the
unless things
general, but
change
my
dramatically.
point is
That
these
won't be the
people who
case
are,
in
might
Illinois.
run need to know so they can get started on fundraising and form a campaign, and you just can't do this at the last minute. So
Well, when we start with the Senate, let's start with the Senate race, and there people seem their Democratic Party and the people who are gunning and ready to run for the U.S. Senate, and those people are known. They're just waiting for Durbin to say he's not running again. None of them wants to say they're going to run if he's running. Nobody wants to sound like they're pushing him out, so they've just been holding up. But in the last week or so, a push poll, I would say almost surely, a poll came out on Democrats who would replace or run to replace Dick Durbin for the U.S. Senate. And it sounded to me like this was a push poll put out or commissioned by Congresswoman Lauren Underwood.
hmm.
I won't go into all the details, but it just sounds like if she had commissioned it. It came out with
Now I should add
she
she has no visibility downstate. So maybe she doesn't need it. There's so many votes in the Chicagoland area, and now even DuPage
right.
is more blue than red. Uh, but that's one I
I
hadn't
don't
really
think
focused on. So
I would say any of the I likely or top-rated Democratic Senate candidates, I don't think any of these folks has much visibility downstate. It's all an upstate thing, and they just assume they'll deal with it, and they'll maybe one or two do a little better than somebody downstate. But this is going to be decided initially by they think upstate. So anyway, the candidates are in this poll. There were four of them, so they didn't have a few. We'll come back to them. But the poll had Lauren Underwood, Raja Krishnamoorthi, who's a congressman. He's been a congressman for 8 years in the 8th Congressional District, had worked a lot with Obama. Lauren Underwood was favored by Obama, so they both have, although those two have strong Obama connections. Robin Kelly, who's been a congresswoman for a number of years from the south side of Chicago, south side going into the south suburbs. And then the current Lieutenant Governor, Julianna Stratton, obviously expected to have support from Governor Pritzker. So those are the four in the poll. And in that poll, which I said sounded like it had been commissioned by Congresswoman Underwood,
why do you say
sounded
that?
like it was well, because she does not have that much name recognition, and in this poll, she came out in the low 30s with Raja Krishnamoorthi, and two, then when they took Robin Kelly out of it, I guess, and told people a little bit more, they give you a little bit more information. It sounds like Underwood. I haven't seen the poll. This is only what's reported. Underwood did a little better. So that's a sign of a push poll where they say, well, let's give a little bit more information positive about Lauren Underwood, and suddenly Underwood's doing better.
Let me throw a name
Anyway,
out, by the way. I'm going to throw you off your pace here, but what about Rahm Emanuel? Is he done, or could he come back? Because it seems to me, Illinois being a blue state has a lot of potential candidates. But I'm just trying to think who would be a candidate that isn't just that has more name recognition. And when you name, as I mentioned earlier, Congresswoman Underwood and Raja Krishnamoorthi, who I've known from past elections, but they don't have a lot of name recognition. Now, a guy like Rahm Emanuel would. I mean, have you heard anything about him, or do you think he's no longer interested in elective
no,
office?
he's come back. He's made the grand entrance here in Chicago. He's been making the rounds. He's been speaking to various groups, and people are even mentioning maybe he could run for president in 2028. He
Well,
seems to
I mean,
think he's
given the
rehabilitated.
dearth of good candidates in the Democratic side to run for president, I could see, because he was a former White House chief of staff, former congressman, and obviously the mayor of Chicago. So while everyone who runs has some baggage, at least I could see that he might be appealing both to some of the more moderates and conservatives that are left in the Democratic Party, but also I think the liberal wing would probably go for whoever the Democrats put up.
Well, remember he had to exit the scene. He was mayor from about 2011 to not about but 2011 to 2019. Selected in 2011 to serve through 2019. And when he was looking at going for a third term, 2017, 18, in the run up to the 2019 election, he had that Laquan McDonald incident in 2016, I think. Actually, I think the event happened in 2014, but it kind of hit the fan in the news more by 2016. And there were hints of a cover up, hints that he had, in the election that was 2015, when that was coming up, there were hints that he kind of covered up some of this stuff that was coming out about the shooting that by Laquan McDonald by
Well,
a
the question is,
policeman,
though,
and
is that
therefore
still going to be a factor
that's the point. The
in
point
two
is
years?
he didn't feel he could run for reelection in the 2019 election, so he didn't. He dropped out. He just didn't run in 2019 for reelection because it looked so bad. He just I don't know chickened out. I guess that's the only word. Now that was 2019. We're now in 2025. He became an ambassador to Japan. He was kind of exiled. He was out of the scene for a while. Have people forgotten that negative image from the Laquan McDonald incident, which a lot was in the Democratic Party? They were not happy with him. They didn't feel he'd been so progressive in the handling of that issue. Whatever. Has he made amends? Now he's come back and he's been talking more like a Bill Clinton Democrat. Been saying things like, "Stop talking about bathrooms, start talking about classrooms." This from a guy who CPS did not perform. The Chicago Public Schools did not perform all that well when Rahm Emanuel was a two-term mayor, and he says, "Stop talking about bathrooms and trans issues, start talking about classroom and improving education." That's the kind of thing Bill Clinton in the 90s would do. Bill Clinton was kind of a current, people would say, a conservative Democrat. Wasn't at all woke in the 90s,
Well, let's
focusing on
take a look at
education
just
and things
before we
like
get
that.
off because we want to move on to some of the others. But here's Alexi Giannoulias, some of the other people that might run. Of course, Secretary of State in Illinois. There's also Treasurer Mike Frericks, and Mike Frericks has been the state treasurer for a number of years, so we could see what happens there. And possibly, but maybe not as likely, we have the Attorney General Kwame Raoul. I would say that Kwame Raoul might more likely be, if he runs for anything, a candidate for governor rather than for the Senate. So,
Well, actually, he was rumored, I think, to be possible candidate for the Senate, and he has said he's not running for anything else. He thinks he has his most impact in the office of Attorney General. Now, people change their minds sometimes. Sometimes people are coy, but those are his words in the last month or
well,
two.
we often
Okay.
say that attorney generals are governors in waiting across the United States. When
Hmm.
you look at people, what did these governors do before they became governor? In quite a number of cases, they had served as the state attorney general and moved up to the governor's race. So uh, Kwame, I believe, is in now his second term. But anyway, that's
And I
another.
will say, in relation to the names you've thrown out there, Alexi Giannoulias, for example, several months ago, when people were talking about who would run to replace Brandon Johnson, who right now he's the mayor of the city of Chicago, and after 2 years, Brandon Johnson's approval rating is about 6%. Hard to imagine a lower rating
It's
than
hard to
Brandon
imagine he
Johnson,
would even run again if his favorabilities are that low.
but you can damn well bet he would run again and he will run again, but that's a whole other
So
discussion.
you saying
But the
that
point
what that
is,
Kwame would run or that Alexi would
no,
run
no,
for
no. The
mayor of
point is,
Chicago?
a few months ago, yeah, Alexi Giannoulias, when people were really talking about mayor, which they've been talking about less in the last month or two, more in the Senate, Alexi Giannoulias and Susana Mendoza were mentioned prominently of running for either the Senate or for mayor. And if the thinking was if Durbin didn't run for reelection, the names that were mentioned most to run for the Senate and the Democratic side, Susana Mendoza and Alexi Giannoulias. And if Durbin did run for reelection, well, then they would run for mayor. That's what the word was a few months ago. In the last, as I mentioned, this recent poll didn't have their two names in that polling, but it had the four names I mentioned. Is it just because, as I said, it may have been a push poll and they kind of wanted to push those two out of there? Who knows?
Well, let me say the
But the point
Republicans.
is,
Go ahead and wrap up your idea. I
yeah.
want to move along.
Well, so that's on the Democratic side. I think there are others, of course, many
Okay,
others.
so let me
Frericks, I don't know what he would
jump
do.
here then.
But
Are we going to
all
governor
I'm
now,
saying, so
or
that's the Senate side. But if you want to mention the Republican side, almost nobody is mentioned as a credible candidate. There are
for the
unknowns who are
U.S.
coming
Senate?
out for the U.S. Senate. Almost
Right. I mean, there
nobody's
are some
mentioned for that.
Republican congressmen, but they're in safe seats, and for a Republican to try to be elected statewide in Illinois is very doubtful. Uh, it's possible,
Well,
but
here,
doubtful. And so, for if you look at some of the Republican congressmen who are holding office and have been there, it's like hard to
I
believe
don't
that
think
they might give up someone like Darren LaHood.
Yeah.
whose father was a longtime
It's a risky
congressman.
bet to run for statewide office in general as a Republican, even more so on the Senate side than on
Well,
the
let me
governor
bring
side.
up here someone you have, in fact, this interview, this photo of, this is Richard Porter. Again, another person that doesn't have at this time a lot of name recognition. But Richard Porter is a big time attorney who's now, I think, no longer practicing, but he could be a potential candidate either for governor or for the Senate on the Republican side. And while a lot of people, maybe voters, haven't heard of Richard Porter does have some big time connections across the country. He was a Republican committeeman, National Republican committeeman for Illinois. He also had worked with Elon Musk and Peter Thiel when they were selling PayPal that they started to, well, when they were selling it, he was negotiating that deal. So when you have connections to pretty close connections and associations with two billionaires, it does tend to help in the fundraising category. But what do you think of Mr. Porter?
I think he is the top candidate of any candidates, and we've got a few, we'll go through them, but of any candidates who would be credible, who have name recognition. He's not run for office before, some of the others have, but he's got name recognition, and he's been active in the Republican Party for quite some time here in Illinois. He's known, he's the RNC, the Republican National Committee member for, I don't know. It's supposed to be an 8-year thing. It seems like he was there 12 years or longer. So he's known well nationally. And you mentioned money. He's got some of his own. He was until recently he had been a partner at Kirkland and Ellis, which is the largest law firm in the world, at about 4,000 attorneys worldwide, dozens of offices across the country and across the world. So there's a lot of outside money that would come in that he could tap to support him. He's knowledgeable about the issues. He was a whiz kid he was in the I guess was going back to the George Herbert Walker administration. I think in the early 90s when George Herbert Walker was the president, uh, Richard Porter was like at 29, something like head of the Domestic Policy Council
How would
for
he, for those who
for
don't know,
Herbert Walker
I would
Bush. I
say
forgot the
Richard
Bush.
Porter
Sorry.
is uh, would be a very effective candidate. That's not to say he would be a shoe-in for election, but he's very articulate. If I compare Richard Porter to Darren Bailey, who ran for governor last time, they're night and day difference. Porter is a Chicagoan, so he would not be turning off the voters in Chicagoland in that big pool of votes the way that Darren Bailey just stood out as a sore thumb, I would say, because he had that southern twang. He was from deep southern Illinois. He was a farmer, where Porter is, as you've already said, he is a lawyer in one of the major firms in Chicago. It seems my argument would be that not only does he have the ability to raise money, not only is smart, not only has he done a lot of work within the Republican Party, both within Illinois and nationally, uh, but he is an articulate, smart candidate who I could see a lot of moderates, if they're looking to get someone besides another person on the far left in the Democratic Party, that he might attract votes from across the aisle, at least the independents as well as the Republicans.
Yes, I think he's viewed as a moderate. Um, I in 2022 in the 2022 election in January 21. I'd have to go back and look at this, but we did a two-part interview with him. So, and he was thinking about running in that election, the 2022 election. He told me at that time in January that he would decide in June. He didn't decide. He did decide in June not to run, but but the point is, he knew the issues then. He'll know the issues now. He's a very polished guy. He's a thoughtful guy. If anybody in the Republican Party would have a shot, anybody who's known now, have a shot of bringing over some persuadable, some moderate Democrats,
Now,
Richard Porter would come
wasn't
to
Porter,
mind.
because you interviewed him, the photograph we showed of Richard Porter was from a previous
Right,
interview. Wasn't he considering at that time running for governor and then he decided not to? Would he go
right.
for governor again if Pritzker, and this is, we can only speculate at this point, but if Governor Pritzker announces that he is not running again because he wants to be available to run for president, would then Porter, in your estimation, what is your guess, would Porter then decide to go for governor?
Well, yeah, I'd say right now, I've talked to him and he hasn't wanted to say it to me, but my operatives tell me, who may know more than I know, that he's probably 80-20, 80%
Leaning
likely
towards
to
running.
run. Number one, leaning towards running and most likely running for governor as opposed to the Senate. They haven't said, but I'm sure part of that consideration, it's a much easier run if JB, some think, I disagree, but a lot of people, he might think it's an easier run if Pritzker doesn't run because all that money, almost $4 billion now in net worth, moves out. Pritzker would give some money to whoever the
Yeah, that's a
candidate
good
is,
point.
but he spent hundreds of
Porter
millions
can
on
raise
his
a lot
own
of money,
race.
but not it's if you're running against a
Not 300
multi-billionaire,
million,
it's a
yeah.
little difficult.
JB can drop 300 million like you and I go to
Right,
Starbucks. Okay,
right.
there
And
you
I
go.
can't afford
And
Starbucks, so there you go.
so the point is, if that happens and JB announces in the next week or two he's not running, I think one, Porter's more likely to
Look,
run
we
and
only
he's
have a
likely to
couple of
run for
9 minutes.
governor.
We've introduced some of the candidates. I want to run through a couple of things here. Because
Hold on, Terry.
Go ahead.
To be fair, can be fair.
All
Maybe
right,
we
go
should
ahead.
focus on the race and do the other things next week because there are other candidates that are mentioned at least for running for governor. They haven't said so, and we should run through them quickly. Jeannie Ives ran in 2018 for governor in the Republican primary against the incumbent Bruce Rauner. And at 700,000 Republican primary voters, she came very close, within 20,000 of winning, something like 360,000 for Rauner, 340,000 for Jeannie Ives. And that race was put together and starting in October, which is pretty late to start a race. So she's quite conservative, quite articulate, quite knowledgeable about the issues, and she's one tough
I would
candidate.
say Janie is
So that's
probably more conservative than Richard Porter.
probably.
And
And we should just
given that,
mention
and I've interviewed Jeannie Ives for well over a decade when she was a state legislator. But it's hard to
well,
say
I
in this
mentioned that.
state with so many, again, Democratic
Right.
voters. I think the question then would be which person would be, for the Republicans, would be most likely to be able to win a general election. Now, did you have anyone else that you
Well,
wanted to mention in the Republican?
yeah, and let me just say between Porter and Ives and the others, and mention about Porter. Some people say because Porter is so much of is perceived as an establishment candidate, he may have more trouble with the grassroots who tend to be
I'm sure some
anti-establishment.
would label him as a
Jeannie has
rhino.
less of that problem. Between those two, Ives certainly has less of that problem.
So then the question
So,
would be between Jeannie Ives, if she ran, and she has not indicated at this point that she would, but if she were to run, then it would be who could win the Republican
well,
nomination.
let's round out the field. And we can do that quickly. I know we only have a few minutes left, but other names that are mentioned who would be credible candidates, and there are a bunch who are mentioned who I think wouldn't
Let's
be,
get
so
to
we're not
them.
going to go through them. The credible candidates, Jesse Sullivan. I've contacted Jesse. He's not gotten back to me, doesn't want to say now, but there's a candidate to be quite credible. He ran before in 2022, first time running, young guy, nice looking family, nice looking guy, articulate and thoughtful, got 16% of the vote, tied with Richard Irvin at 16% each. Remember, Irvin was the candidate, Ken Griffin fell apart and collapsed relative to Darren Bailey, who got about 60%. So Sullivan is certainly a possible candidate and would be credible. Early on, he got $10 million from two different donors, so he had money. He
All
could
right, who
probably go
else?
back.
Who else do we?
Darren Bailey has said he wouldn't run again, but lately people are saying he might. He certainly has a lot of name
I
recognition, as
would
you point out,
opine
downstate.
that I think Mr. Bailey has kind of shown that he wouldn't be acceptable in a general election to voter because he didn't even come
Right, but
close.
that doesn't stop a lot of
No, but
primary
he also
voters
ran
from voting
against
for him.
one of the congressmen, Mike Boss, down and lost that effort to be the Republican
And the
congressman.
rumor is he thinks he might want to come back and try again because that was pretty close. But so Darren might rather run for that than run for governor again. Okay, so in addition to Sullivan and Bailey, there's a name, Todd Ricketts. And Todd, I think my operatives tell me, I haven't asked him, is unlikely to run for a variety of reasons. But Ricketts is part of the Ricketts family, which owns the Chicago Cubs, which comes out of Joe Ricketts, who started E-Trade. So there's money in the family, there's name in the family. Todd Ricketts also has a
I believe his
national
brother is the
connection.
governor of Nebraska, isn't it?
That's right. Well, I think he was the. I think he's the
The
senator
senator now,
now.
a
He
farmer.
was
So
the
you're right,
governor.
yeah.
He was the
Right.
governor. He went from governor, if I got this
Yeah,
right, to
you're right. You're
senator.
right. He's in the
He is
U.S.
the
Senate.
senator right now. That's Peter
So
Ricketts.
also,
So it's
Peter,
a
I mean, there would be some support from around the country with those connections to
well, one
raise
other
money.
connection to throw in quickly. He was the chair of the
We
Republican
only have about two
National
minutes, so if
Finance
there's any
Committee.
other name you want to get in, let's get to it.
I think those. I think for governor, we said Porter, we said Ives, Ricketts, Sullivan, Bailey. Sometimes people mention LaHood. Again, I think that's kind of a risky move.
Congressman Darren
He's probably
LaHood
likely to
in
stay for
Peoria area.
Congress. There's a guy by the name of Dave Nyack who said he might run for either governor or senator. Strange, a year ago he ran in a Democratic primary for state senate. But I
If I
think
would
we've
just say now
exhausted the
that the
names.
Republicans have 53 Senate seats and the vice president's vote, they're in pretty good shape in controlling the Senate. The governorship, if the Republicans were able to elect a governor, that would be huge for the Republican Party, uh, who has just been decimated in Illinois. It would be huge to rebuild the Republican Party. It would be good for giving the Republican members of the state legislature and the state Senate there, giving them some leverage. If you had a Republican governor who could say, no, I'm going to veto these bills that the Democratic legislature with their supermajority passed, it would be a whole new ballgame than what we have had under Governor Pritzker and with the
Well,
Democrats controlling
well, let me just
overwhelmingly
say in
both.
closing, we're almost closing. Strategically, the National Republican Party, some of those folks think Illinois has some potential, at least on one or two House seats. They're looking around the whole country. If they
The
can pick up a
potential to
seat
pick
or
up
two
some
here and a seat or
congressional
two there,
seats in
they
Illinois, is
want
that
to.
what you're saying?
And no, yeah, right in Illinois, because they want to
Okay, we only got
buttress,
about
they want
30
to
seconds,
strengthen
so is that
they want to strengthen their mark. So I'll just say this: J.B. Pritzker is a lot weaker than people perceive. His performance has not been good. He's got a lot of money, has not improved education, not improved pensions, not improved crime, not improved the economy. He's a candidate who could be beat, notwithstanding his money. Not a lot of
well,
people will say that. I
maybe.
just do.
I think obviously there's arguments against that, which we don't have time to get into. My
Well, I'll say
bet, hang on,
if
my
you
bet would be that
go
J.B.
ahead.
Pritzker does
Yes,
not
sir.
run again, and that he goes for presidency. He will have spent basically 8 years being governor at that point.
Okay,
That gives him
then
a foundation to run, and I think he's like been there, done that. To stay around for another 4 years,
okay,
I
Terry,
think is difficult.
assuming you're right, the argument's even stronger than I made because then you have somebody who's
Okay,
probably an
Jeff, I'm
unknown,
going to
not
insert. We
as
got
good
to
as
say
JB.
goodbye, and folks, give us your
There
thoughts.
you go.
Thanks so much.